Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. Myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War news update. Third part thereof for the 27th of July 2024. We're going to start in this geopolitics video with looking at the Nordics. So now with Finland and Sweden in NATO, the Nordics want to fight together almost as one military. NATO has to redraw its map to make their waters and territories into one area under Article 5. Here's how NATO will project power across its expanded map. I thought this is going to be an interesting look into what the result has been from Russia invading, or Putin invading Ukraine because he was worried about NATO encroachment, has forced NATO to do what they have done, or forced countries to want to go towards NATO. It's not NATO necessarily taking countries and projecting power like that. It's countries coming to NATO and saying, we'd rather be with you and we're afraid of what Russia is capable of. So we want to be part of this defensive alliance. And we sit there now at this extended border, bordering Russia, with a view that Russia are the bad guys and they are encroaching on us. And of course, it's interesting that it can be played both ways. And the Russian narrative is often this, and I've just responded to this like 55 seconds ago. It's got there. So NATO appears to be less and less a defensive alliance, says Rando here. It's become an encroaching and growing force based on geopolitical dominance rather than a counterbalance that ensured peace, really souring on its existence. And I'm like, if true, I wonder what has forced them to this point. Methinks the desire to, with Blinken's sight, want to blame NATO for everything is to excuse Putin for everything. Got it. Right. So in other words, like, let's blame NATO for encroachment rather than saying, well, they wouldn't be doing that if Russia weren't going around invading countries, right? So don't talk about that being an offensive, now a more offensive accumulation of countries, or organisation of countries, without accepting that that has been itself prompted that move to enlarge, which is voluntarily done by those nations that move towards NATO, has been done precisely because Russia has been doing more than fricking encroaching, it's been invading. Like, it just winds me up, as you can tell, that people see that, look at NATO encroaching and expanding. There's NATO expansionism. I'm just going to ignore the fact that they've expanded by actually invading another country, and these guys are responding directly to that. I'm just going to ignore that and look at the causality over here. Go, oh, you horrible NATO lot. Oh, I'm really souring with regard to you guys. But Putin, by all means, yeah, once you've done that, I'd have a go at Georgia. And then, why not take all the stans back? Just, let's have the USSR back. But that's not encroachment. That's not invasion. It's just objective borders, cherry-picked out of some chronological slice of history. But anyway, onto the kind of off the rant, onto the geopolitical analysis here. I think this is an interesting scenario where we've got the Nordics not just, being useful geographically, but actually giving a benefit to NATO in terms of a very accomplished military among those nations. You can argue Norway with navy as much and Arctic abilities, but also conscription that takes place, and the Finnish military and Sweden. It's all they are bringing a lot to the table, as well as being incredibly important geographically. If Russia were to challenge Norway, it might do so in a place like sorry, just to rewind. In fact, no. I'm going to go towards the end of this, because I don't want to have to go through all of this article with you. So the idea of force integration dates back as far as World War I, when the US military sent its troops to fight directly within better established, if worn out, British and French units. Quote, we should not have different responsibilities, Christopherson added. We should all have a balanced force. We should integrate them. The Nordic chiefs of defence are already envisioning putting a land command for the region in Finland, and an air command in Norway, and a logistics command in Sweden. The Nordic chiefs have figured out haven't figured out where to put a naval command yet, as they juggle how to split their ships among the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean. They do know, however, that they want to have a combined naval task force with the Baltic navies in the Baltic Sea. Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden are looking at integration all the way down to tank units and infantry platoons. Iceland has a base for the US P-8 Poseidon aircraft that can hunt submarines, but no standby military. The region's air forces have been exercising together for years. Quote, "We can initiate an activity the day before we cross borders, and we train and exercise in each country's airspace," said General Mikael Biden, the Swedish chief of defence. Norway already lands its Air Force jets on Finnish runways. On the ground, Sweden started the process of sending brigade-sized units over the border to Finland for live-fire exercises. There are only 4 in the whole Swedish army. The question is how far the integration can go. They're getting on the same page of using all the same weapons, but they will still need US enablers. About 70% of NATO military capabilities still come from the US, said Ketil Olsen, Norway's former military representative to NATO, who now runs Andøya Space, a rocket launch pad in northern Norway. The Nordic countries formed a defence bloc in 2009, but they have fought over minute details for more than a decade. They fought over building a jointly procured armoured personnel carrier. Only 25% of the vehicle was commonly made. They even fought over what colour their uniforms should be. "We couldn't agree on anything, to be honest," Olsen said. "Norway's most sensitive defence talks are not with the other Nordic countries, but with the Americans and the Brits on intelligence, space, and special operations. The countries will need to establish a core-level headquarters for the region that's big enough to house up to 45,000 troops in wartime, but the biggest problem is fighting at scale. Finland can conscript some 280,000 troops from civilian ranks for war and put more than 3 times the number of reservists on active duty, but Norway and Sweden can only call up a fraction of that. They'll need even more to take on the Russians." We're going to be swimming or sinking together, Swedish Defence Minister Paul Jonsson said in an interview. There's also a strong linkage between what happens in the Baltic Sea and the High North as well. So interesting that this is not just the Nordics. You can take into account the Baltics as well, obviously Poland, then UK. I mean, this is obviously a fascinating area of the world anyway, with its proximity to Russia, and you've got the Baltic Sea with only a tiny little bit of access for Russia. You've got Kaliningrad as an exclave there. Then you've got the Arctic up here in Murmansk area. To take, for example, Olenja Air Base, it was hit just this morning. That's in this whole peninsula area there. So it's a very, very interesting part of the world. I think seeing these NATO countries work closer and closer together is good news for NATO and bad news for Russia. Lots more to talk about in this article. I'm just trying to see if the conclusion any sort of conclusion can be gained from the end of the article. You got submarines to talk about, of course, but anyway, I think the whole point that I'm trying to make at the moment is that Russia has really scored an own goal, shot itself in the foot by starting this war in Ukraine, or this latest iteration of the war in Ukraine from February 2022, in that they have emboldened and strengthened NATO to a point that they would have never envisaged previously. And in fact, they're very much causing NATO to do the things that they were accusing NATO of as justification, post hoc rationalization, after the fact rationalization of why they invaded Ukraine. Has been in fact caused by, it's almost some self-fulfilling prophecy of Russia in some weird way, where they brought about the very thing that they were slagging off. But anyway, it's just a hot mess, I think, for Russia. And Russia have got to the point where even if they gain the most optimal situation from this war, like if you can think of the spectrum of results from this war, from a massive Ukrainian success with Russia having a regime change and going down the toilet for 20 years or whatever, to the very best outcome for the Russians. The very best outcome for the Russians is still way worse than they would have achieved. Way worse than their status would have been had they not invaded Ukraine. It's just they can't get back to where they were. So the very best outcome is still an absolute steaming pile of dog turd compared to what would have been had they not been so expansionist. Just it will go down. I swear the invasion of Ukraine will go down as one of the worst geopolitical decisions in history. But anyway, from Ukraine's point of view, they are looking to China and India to try and cozy up, or at least try and get some influence in those two BRICS member states who are certainly with China very close to Russia, at least out of a marriage of convenience. I don't think they particularly care for Russia that much, but actually they now see Russia as a vassal state that they can leverage all sorts of stuff out of, like cheap hydrocarbons, because Russia are desperate for support from China. Well, the same can be said for India, and they're going to be getting cheap, and they are getting cheap hydrocarbons. They could also be leveraging other sorts of things. So these are the two countries that Ukraine are going to be looking at very closely. And Indian Prime Minister Modi is scheduled to visit Kyiv in August for the first time since Russia's invasion in February 2022. The visit is planned for the third week of August, likely August the 23rd, as confirmed by diplomatic sources in Delhi. And Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba stated, he's just been to China, of course, that Ukraine has received a clear signal that China is working to end Russia's war against Ukraine. I don't know what the details of that are, but he seemed to be fairly content coming back from China, that at least the right sorts of things were being said by China. Now, you've got this ongoing issue with Lukoil oil going through from Russia through Ukraine to Slovakia and Hungary. That's been turned off by the Ukrainians because they're not happy with Slovakia and Hungary supporting Russia. Now, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico has discussed resuming the transit of Russian Lukoil's oil through Ukraine with Ukrainian Foreign Minister, actually it's not Foreign Minister, it's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. Fico proposed a technical solution. The Slovak government highlighted the importance of restoring this oil transit for the Slovneft oil refinery, and as alternative oil sources are more costly and may not be suitable technologically. Oh, I wonder if Fico's going with cap in hand to Shmyhal, or somehow this kind of game of leverage is actually one where Ukraine might come out on top and force Slovakia to make some concessions. I don't know. It's a really bold move, and one that I'm sure we'll keep an eye on. Orban is shredding the EU for Putin, says Jay in Kiev with his usual rhetoric, still hoping he'll be given the Transcarpathia region of Ukraine as Putin promised on the eve of the invasion. So, parroting Kremlin narratives, this is reference to this point, Prime Minister Orban has just accused the USA of being behind the terrorist act of blowing up Nord Stream 2 and singled out his enemy in Europe, Poland. Here's a translation of what he said during his annual Baila Tuznad Tuzvanios speech in Romania. Quote, some people describe Russia as a rigid neo-Stalinist autocracy, which is false. In reality, we are talking about a country that shows technical, economic and potentially social flexibility as well. That's just utter BS. Social flexibility. You're not allowed to be this. You can't be LGBT, or you are extremist, terrorist, and we're going to lock you away. But we're socially flexible. European politics, he continues, have collapsed. Europe has abandoned the protection of its own interests. Today, Europe does nothing but follow the foreign policy of the USA's Democratic Party unconditionally, even at the cost of self-harm. So he's not only taking a shot at the US, he's taking a shot at the US Democrats because he really wants Trump to win, right? The sanctions we have implemented fundamentally harm European interests, drive up energy prices and render the European economy uncompetitive. The fact that we remain silent about the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline that Germany itself remains silent about, an obvious act of terrorism carried out with American oversight against its own property, and that we do not investigate, do not seek to clarify, and do not raise this legally, just as we did not act correctly regarding Angela Merkel's wiretapping, which was executed with Denmark's help. This is nothing but an act of submission. This is a complex relationship here, which I will try to explain in a necessarily simplified but comprehensive way. European politics have also collapsed since the beginning of the Russia-Ukrainian war, because the essence of the European power system was the Paris-Berlin axis. It was indispensable. This was the centre, this was the axis. Since the war, another centre and another axis of power has emerged. The Berlin-Paris axis no longer exists, or if it does, it has become irrelevant and circumventable. The new centre of power and axis now looks like London, Warsaw, Kiev, the Baltic states, and the Scandinavians. Right, he's really going for it here, isn't he? Do not think that when you see the German Chancellor announce that he is only sending helmets to the war, and then a week later announces that no, they are also sending weapons, and and then when he announces that there can be sanctions, but they should not extend to energy, and then 2 weeks later he himself leads the sanction policy, you might think this man has lost his mind. Quite the opposite. He is very much in his right mind. He sees exactly what that the Americans and the liberal opinion forming vehicles that they influence, universities, think tanks, research institutes, media, are punishing the German-French policy of that does not align with American interests through public opinion. So again, the typical thing of having a go at universities, like he's done back in his home country of Hungary, closing down Central European University that's owned by George Soros, shutting down think tanks and research institutes, and closing down free press and the media, like the sort of things that he would like to see done in the US, the sort of thing that the Heritage Foundation Project 2025 is looking at doing. This is why he continues the phenomenon I talked about occurs. Then this is why we see these peculiar leaps in the German Chancellor's policies. Changing the power centre in Europe and bypassing the French-German axis is not a new idea. Just the war made it finally possible. The idea existed before. It's actually an old Polish plan which aims to solve Poland's problem, being wedged between a giant German state and a giant Russian state by making Poland America's #1 European stronghold. We could say it is inviting in the Americans' troops there between the Germans and the Russians. Poland spends 5% of its national gross product on military expenses today, and the Polish army is the second largest in Europe after the French. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people. There's an old plan to weaken Russia and outpace Germany. At first glance, outpacing Germany may seem like a fantastical idea, but if we look to the development dynamics of Germany, Central Europe and Poland, it no longer seems impossible, especially if Germany in the meantime dismantles its own world-class industry. Poland gave up cooperation with the V4, Visegrad 4 group, for this strategy. The V4 meant something different. The V4 means acknowledging that there is a strong Germany, there is a strong Russia, and in cooperation with Central European states, we create a third player between the two. The Poles backed out of this and started implementing another strategy that bypasses the German-French axis instead of the V4 strategy that accepted the German-French axis. Since we are talking about our Polish brothers, let us mention quietly, especially now that they have kicked our backside enough, we might allow ourselves to say a few blunt, honest, brotherly words. So the Poles are practicing the most hypocritical and sanctimonious politics in all of Europe. They morally lecture us, criticise us for our economic relations with the Russians, and meanwhile they unashamedly do business with the Russians and buy oil through intermediaries running the Polish economy with it. Even the French are better, who surpassed us last month in purchasing gas from the Russians, but at least do not lecture us on moral grounds. The Poles do business and lecture us. I have not seen such deep hypocritical politics in Europe in the past 10 years. Now, interesting points there, of course, this is back to me, where you could throw some criticisms against some of these nations who are still often through backdoors buying Russian energy while saying that other people shouldn't buy Russian energy. But then I think it's this idea that you try and sanction them, and then if it does get to you, then it comes through refinement through India or whatever, and the value added is being added by other nations, and Russia actually get less money from those exports than they otherwise would directly, say, through the Lukoil pipelines to Hungary. Anyway, I digress. To truly understand the significance of bypassing the German-French axis, we can recall that 20 years ago, when the Americans attacked Iraq and called on European countries to join, we, for example, joined as a NATO member. Schroeder, Chirac, and then French president, and then German chancellor, and Putin, the Russian president, held a press conference together against the Iraq war. There was still a way of thinking approaching an independent European interest in the French-German logic back then. Ladies and gentlemen, beyond aiming for peace, the peace mission also urges Europe to finally pursue independent politics. The speech went on, says your man here. Orban mentioned that he had just had a phone call with Donald Trump on Friday. Later, he said that Hungary's grand strategy would be executed in the next 12 years if Trump wins in November. And then his vice president, J.D. Vance, a big fan of Viktor Orban, is subsequently elected president twice. So the Hungarian view, or the Viktor Orban view of Hungary's positioning, is to cozy up to Russia, unashamedly, unabashedly, close to Russia, but also close to a Trumpian America, where you'd have Trump in for one more term. He's then term limited, and then J.D. Vance gets in for 2 terms. Big fan of Viktor Orban, and you've got Hungary playing the conduit between Russia and a pro-Russian state of the US. And it's like, that's what he wants. He wants his bread buttered on both sides, and by 2 great superpowers, and Hungary's in the middle. But of course, they would be rather dictatorial superpowers. Certainly, Russia is. Hungary are looking to be more and more, and he wants the US to go in that direction as well through a Trump presidency. Now, according to Ageopress, Orban said the EU will have to bear the consequences of supporting war in Ukraine if Trump wins. He said if Europe doesn't have a peace policy and Trump wins the US election, the EU will have to admit defeat. European Union will have to pay the price for this military venture, and it will also affect us. Of course, it's this kind of rhetoric that again looks solely at the West in supporting Ukraine and blames them for these higher costs rather than blaming Russia for doing something horrific. You know, it's like the sort of thing is like, you know, I live in an old person's like residential village, right? And there's been a hurricane and it's blown down the fences, and it's like we build up the fences, and then old Jimmy next door says, bloody extra cost for us, are you building those fences? Like, yeah, it was a hurricane what did it, mate. And if we want to live in a place that's protected, and if we want to live in a more secure environment, then we need to build up those fences, dude. Like, don't just blame the building of the fences. How about looking at what caused that fence to be blown down? Okay, that's where the blame lies. So it's like always looking at blaming the EU for reacting to what Russia has done. But of course, he completely absolves Russia of any responsibility. And it's always EU's fault, going back to like that kind of comment of the guy against NATO. And it's that thinking that really, really irritates me. Viktor Orban is just a big Jabba the Hutt with the same moral compass. Washington Post reports that Russia is wary of surprises in the US and French elections, and Kamala Harris in particular. Quote, when Biden announced that he was withdrawing his candidacy for re-election, the shake-up in US politics came as a blow to many members of the Russian elite who closely monitor relations between Moscow and the West. It's been really interesting to listen to what the propagandists say and what the elites say, and there's a really big concern among many in Russia that, I said this yesterday, that if Harris wins, then the whole plan for winning the war in Ukraine, which revolves around Trump getting in so that the weapons get turned off and the support gets turned off for Ukraine, they can't win on the battlefield, right? Russia don't have the equipment. Simply put, they don't have the equipment to win on the battlefield when 50 nations are continually supplying Ukraine with equipment. They can maybe win on more human beings, but as we're hearing, they are offering almost £50,000 to a soldier to join up from the Moscow region because they're so desperate for people to join, and they don't have the people that want to do that. And if they go for mass mobilization, they already had 1 million people running away previously, and it would be deeply unpopular. And so they're kind of stuck. We can't win this by just throwing more and more and more and more people, because actually that's what we've been doing, and we're screwed, and it's hammering our economy because we've got a massive labour shortage. So they're in a real bind. What they need, the only option for the Russians, the only outcome they can achieve is for someone like Trump to come along and force the two to the negotiating table, and have something like the US administration forcibly scapegoat supporting Ukraine in a peace negotiation. So you're forcing them to the table, and then Russia get at least something that they want. They're not going to get a maximalist gain out of anything anymore. Like, they're never getting the whole of Ukraine. Can they keep hold of what they've got and argue for a little bit more, like the rest of Kherson, the rest of Zaporizhia, the rest of the Donbass? Yeah, they're going to be going for that. And if they've got Orban and Fico and Trump on their side, forcing that to happen, then they don't need to win on a battlefield. They will win politically. Now, if Harris comes in, that whole plan is ruined. So whatever you as an American, if you're watching this as an American and you're pro-Trump and you're pro-Republican, okay, fair enough. And you might support Trump on lots of other things like immigration, whatever. I'm not really interested. But I think it is prima facie bleeding obvious by what Trump has said repeatedly, by what his son has said repeatedly, by what JD Vance has said repeatedly, by what people like Steve Bannon and Steve Miller have said, repeatedly, by what people are in the Project 2025 camp and Heritage Foundation have said, repeatedly. It is very clear that he is not going to be a big fan of supporting Ukraine in the same way that the US has already supported Ukraine. Right, and so that is what the Russians are banking on, and they are particularly worried, and you can tell this because their propagandists have just been shitting bricks basically about the polling and what's been going on with this big Kamala Harris bounce in terms of registrations, and poll numbers are now equalized just in like less than a week, and so this is a worry for the Russians. Now, on the other hand, you get something like this. So Wall Street Journal opinion pieces. The Wall Street Journal is a Murdoch paper that's kind of pro-Trumpian, or certainly pro-Republican. You've got an opinion piece by David Urban and Mike Pompeo. And of course, Mike Pompeo has some history with Trump, etc., etc. Was on his administration. So this is a peace plan, and lots of people say, oh, this is a really good peace plan. Yeah, oh, Trump could do this, and making a mistake that this opinion piece is actually what Trump would do. But this opinion piece is a complete modal aspiration. Like, is a complete, like, this could happen. I would like this to happen. So he says, while Mr. Biden stumbled into war through weakness, Mr. Trump could re-establish peace through strength. Here's how a successful plan for Ukraine might look. Now, I could bore you with everything they say here. Everything they say is pretty, like, good, right? Yeah, that's good. Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Well done for saying that. Trump could do that. Trump could also travel to the moon in a space rocket and throw out some frisbees onto the moon and try and see how far they got. Yeah? What's the chance of him doing that? Pretty low. Okay, so let's not think about that then, because that's just pie in the sky thinking. So, yeah, you could get Trump doing this, but the probability of this is vanishingly small because he's already told us what he's going to do, and it's not this. So people are getting quite, oh yeah, pro-Trump people, and there's some of you out there who listen to me, who might get onto something like this and say, yeah, but look at this, but look what Trump could do, and try and, because you convince yourself that Trump is still the right guy for the job. And so when someone gives you just a bit of cheese, oh, here you go, come on, you get sucked into that. Go, yeah, this is what Trump could do, yeah, because it gives you the hope that he's still the right guy for Ukraine. But there's no data to support that he's the right guy for Ukraine. And all this is just complete hopium that Trump could deliver some kind of vaguely rational peace plan. Now, as Timofey Milovanov says, he was a previous minister for Ukraine from the Kiev School of Economics. He says, Pompeo and Urban argue that self-interested Trump will be a bigger friend of Ukraine than Democrats. Trump's plan, deny Russia oil revenue, isolate Russia economically, strengthen NATO, $500 billion lend-lease to Ukraine. Ukraine strikes whatever and whenever it wants. But first, they say that there's no evidence that Trump will capitulate Ukraine to Russia. In fact, they say the opposite is true. Trump lifted the Obama's arms embargo on Ukraine, providing javelins that helped save Kiev in the earliest days of Russia's invasion. Now, I've done a whole video on the javelin thing, and that is a complete myth. So the fact that Mike Pompeo doesn't even understand what happened leaves me with little hope that this plan is in any way rational. So remember, just to give you the synopsis of the javelin situation, Congress, bipartisan, mainly McCain, Republican McCain, but Democrats as well, and Republicans in Congress, sensible people went, well, let's give a load of stuff to Ukraine. And then Trump came along and said, and this has been bubbling since 2014, right? He said, right, we want to give javelins to Ukraine, what are you going to give? And then Trump came along and said, okay, but you're not going to give those javelins to Ukraine until Zelensky gives me dirt on Biden, and then stop them giving the javelins. And that's why he was impeached. He was impeached precisely because he didn't give the javelins to Ukraine and tried to use it as leverage to get dirt for his own political benefit, not for the benefit of the US, but for his own personal political benefit. And that was a key difference. And so that these guys don't understand that, it means that, well, their foundation is incorrect. Also, quote, Mr. Trump gave political cover to House Speaker Mike Johnson when he maneuvered to pass additional military aid. And helping Ukraine and, quote, revitalizing the American defense industrial base in Alabama, Pennsylvania, and Virginia is good policy and good politics. Which is all fair enough, but actually he didn't give cover, and he was stopping Mike Johnson for 7 months of doing that. So again, it's a complete bastardization of the truth. There is a fair, in my view, attack on the Biden administration policy. Quote, the Biden administration's sanctions sound good on paper but are hollow. The Treasury, for example, exempts Russian banks from US sanctions if their transactions are related to energy production, the most important revenue source for the Kremlin's war machine. The problem here is that energy production will massively negatively affect EU, Europe, and US energy prices. It will cause massive inflation. And so sanctions have to be really carefully done. You need to screw over Russia without screwing over yourselves, because if you have inflation everywhere else, then people will stop wanting to support Ukraine, right? And so you need to understand that. Anyway, the critique of NATO is framed as a push to strengthen NATO, quote, revitalise a North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. This includes making Europeans pay their fair share. It's time to raise the bar on spending to 3% of member countries' gross domestic product, which is, fair enough. But the idea is that this is basically pie in the sky thinking that is not at all evidenced in the thought processes of either Trump or anyone around Trump, other than people who are too distant, who are very supportive of Ukraine, but don't understand that Trump just is not on Trump's radar. Michael McFaul, interestingly, so he is the Professor of Political Science, Director of Freeman Spogli Institute and Hoover's Senior Fellow at Stanford University. He was a US Ambassador to Russia 2012 to 2014, big support of Ukraine, has written a big piece on his Substack about how Vice President Harris's views on the war in Ukraine, Russia and Belarus, written on that, and said that she is the better one to go for. So in the fight between autocrats and Democrats in Europe, Harris firmly supports Democrats. Trump does not. So he's, again, you only need to look at what Trump says and does in how he speaks about Viktor Orban and how he accepts Viktor Orban on the red carpet. Doesn't Donald Tusk? No. Emmanuel Macron? No. Spanish president, the Portuguese president, and prime ministers in the Nordics, and anyone else? No, just Orban. Just Orban. Okay. So you know who Trump prefers. Is it Democrats or dictators? Dictators every time a coconut. Every time. Roll up. Every time a coconut. Dictator. Every time. Bosh. This is a coconut shy, throw your ball at any of these coconuts. You can have Bolsonaro. Oh, he's been knocked off. Okay. You can have Xi Jinping. You can have Vladimir Putin. You can have Viktor Orban. We've got some new guys on. There's one just over there. Robert Fitzo. You might like to throw your ball at him every time a coconut. Go for it. Trump's there wanging his balls into the coconuts, as you do. And, that's what he wants to do. He's over there. It's like, yeah, fish out a democratically elected leader. Get your duck out of the pond here with this fishing rod. He's forgetting that. He's right at the dictator coconut shy. Sorry, my metaphors sometimes go off on one. I need to stop eating so many mushrooms. I obviously don't. I'm a very clean individual. Right. Tendar's opinion about what's been going on. So he's a source I go to a lot, a German guy. So it's been a week since President Biden's dropped out of the presidential race, making way for Harris. Watching the Republican response to this unfolding situation was quite something. To say that GOP is in disarray would be too much, at least at this stage. However, they're absolutely clueless and even more hapless to deal with the situation. Trump looks now decades older, and JD Vance hits his funny bone at each couch he is passing by. As a reference, go and look it up. Visually, they both deliver an atrocious picture. So now this goes in, okay, whatever. Some of you might be like, oh, whatever. Now we get onto the kind of Russia situation. So for Russians, the game has completely changed. Watching their cringe talk shows before Biden's departure was like watching somebody victory lapping miles before the finishing line. It was absurd, but being absurd is a Russian constant. Anyway, however, their good moods have come to an abrupt end. They fear Kamala Harris even more than Biden, and they see that she is not only has a very realistic chance of winning, but will be far more complicated than Biden was. Having her for the next 4 years in the White House is way too long for the Russian capacities to sustain the war. I reported about this several times. Ever since then, Russians have started attacking her, but their attacks are just as hapless as the Republican attempts. It is obvious that neither of them has the right formula to tackle the situation. This bodes not well for both Republicans and Putin. The situation has become even that weird that Mike Pompeo announced that Trump will go stronger against Putin than Biden ever did. This attempt alone is eyebrow-raising. It shows that apparently Republicans understand that supporting Putin is not a winning strategy and against US interests. The latest Russian incursions into US-controlled airspace near Alaska, where US and Canadian fighter jets had to intercept Russian strategic bombers, reminded us once again that Russia is America's enemy. Some Republicans understand that and apparently sent Pompeo to release those words. The problem, however, is that they are just words, and even when it would be only wise for Republicans to drop their isolationism, as Nikki Haley might rightly stated, it is questionable if they would follow through. The presidential race is far from over and nothing should be too simplified, as I mentioned above. Biden's departure is a good thing because it offers a younger generation chances. This gives Democrats a great advantage. It would be ideal if Republicans would drop their old candidate, but I don't hold my breath. All in all, this whole episode reminds me that Nikki Haley said in the beginning of this year. Quote, most Americans do not want a rematch between Biden and Trump. The first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the party that wins the election. Her words might be prophetic. And of course, Nikki Haley would be great for Ukraine as a GOP leader. Now because she realized that if she didn't pay fealty to Trump, she would be cast aside politically, and she's looking really at 2029. She's therefore, wanting to be part of the GOP, which has become Trump's party, had to pay fealty to Trump. But the things she was saying about Trump are just as true now as they were when she said them with regard to things like Ukraine. And she was absolutely on the money. Now you've had her supporters, the Haley voters. So you've got a group of Haley voters, a kind of super PAC, who are putting their money and support now behind Harris. They're called Haley Voters for Harris. And she's now tried to take them to court so that a cease and desist letter has been sent by her lawyers so that they don't use the name Haley, but they're like, but we are Haley voters. So she doesn't have a leg to stand on. So they get to keep their name Haley Voters for Harris because they were Haley voters. And now that Haley's dropped out, we support Harris. And so interesting dynamics going on in the US election. And Mark Kelly, who is very much pro-Ukrainian and strong, being the former Navy captain and pilot who's been involved with helping Ukrainians train on F-16s, was an astronaut. He's very strong on support for Ukraine. He's been to Ukraine a couple of times recently, and he is becoming more and more talked about as a VP choice for Harris. So watch that space. He could be the one, especially as you're thinking, Israel, Gaza. And your number two for Harris might be Josh Shapiro, but he's Jewish. And there's do you put, although he's quite nuanced on the war, do you shy away from that potentially hornet's nest and move towards a safer option with the Arizona senator? I don't know, but it'd be, a lot of people are thinking you might get a Harris, a Kelly ticket, which would be interesting. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'll try and do an American politics update later today. Take care, guys. Speak soon.